Why is it that you're still going to work, still replying to messages, still finishing everything on your list? And yet somewhere underneath, you sense that you're operating, but not really living inside your own life? Why is it that when you finally pause for a moment, you realize your body had been signaling you all along? The tight throat, the dull headaches, the heaviness in your chest, the kind of exhaustion sleep doesn't fix, and you instinctively push it down, telling yourself, "It's fine. Just get through this. I'll rest later." And why is it that when this state continues, you don't become more attentive to yourself? You become better at performing? You smile when it's expected? You socialize when required? You say, "I'm fine," so naturally no one questions it. Until one day you realize you're not just tired, you've become accustomed to not listening to how tired you actually are. If any of this feels familiar, then today's conversation is not about becoming tougher, more disciplined, or pushing through just a little longer. What we're exploring instead is something quieter and far more common. Why the most damaging form of suffering is rarely explosive breakdown, but the slow, unnoticed way you help sustain your own cycle of pain. And why, when you lose connection with your body's early warning system, still functioning can become a deeply disguised form of suffering. Most suffering doesn't announce itself dramatically. It begins subtly. A persistent fatigue when you wake up, a pressure behind your eyes during meetings, a weekend that's technically free, but somehow still doesn't feel restful. You can still work. You can still respond. You can still get through the day. So you tell yourself, it's nothing. But these signals are not random. They are your nervous system communicating that the load is increasing. Psychology views the stress response as an adaptive survival mechanism. When demands rise, your sympathetic nervous system activates, increasing focus, alertness, efficiency. In the short term, this is useful. The problem begins when that heightened state becomes chronic and you start treating it as normal. You tell yourself, everyone's tired. It'll calm down after this week. I just need to push through. Each time you override the signal, your system recalibrates. And when your body realizes the warnings aren't being heard, it doesn't collapse immediately. It lowers the volume. Fatigue becomes numbness. Anxiety becomes dullness. Interest fades quietly. You interpret this as adaptation, as resilience. But what's actually happening is gradual disconnection. The true deepening of suffering often doesn't begin with external pressure. It begins the moment you stop responding to your own internal alerts. Not because you're weak, but because you've learned to keep going at the cost of feeling. Just hang in there. It sounds strong, responsible, mature, but often it's a strategy for postponing collapse. You haven't slept well for weeks, yet you tell yourself, it'll get better after this project. Your relationship feels suffocating, yet you say, now isn't the time to deal with this. You're near your limit, yet you keep adding commitments to your calendar. This isn't strength. It's avoidance wearing the mask of discipline. Research shows that when people face prolonged stress without a sense of control, the brain prioritizes short-term anxiety relief over long-term resolution. So you stay busy, you scroll, you overwork, you plan the next task. As long as you don't stop, you don't have to fully feel the exhaustion underneath. But your nervous system isn't fooled. When stress becomes chronic, cortisol levels remain elevated. Over time, the brain begins conserving energy. It reduces emotional processing. It dampens pleasure responses. It lowers motivation. You become functional, but you feel less alive. That's the illusion of endurance. On the surface, you're still moving forward. Underneath, you're borrowing energy from your future self. The cycle doesn't begin with failure. It begins every time you say, I'm fine, I can handle a little more. When pressure lasts too long, the brain does not keep fighting indefinitely. It shifts strategies. Neuroscience shows that under chronic stress, the brain reallocates resources to prioritize survival-related functions. Systems associated with creativity, curiosity, and emotional depth are gradually deprioritized. This isn't laziness, it isn't indifference, it's protection. You may notice subtle changes. Movies don't move you the way they used to. Music feels flatter. Plans that once excited you now feel like obligations. You can still complete tasks, you can still show up, but the emotional color drains. Psychology refers to this state as emotional numbing. It commonly appears after prolonged stress, trauma, or sustained self-suppression. When escape from pressure feels impossible, the brain lowers emotional intensity to prevent overload. This is survival mode. The danger is not the shutdown itself, it's mistaking it for recovery. Because when emotional range narrows, suffering doesn't disappear. It becomes quiet. And the quieter it becomes, the easier it is to believe you're simply less sensitive now. But what's actually happening is partial disconnection, not from the world, but from your own inner signals. And the longer that state persists, the harder it becomes to remember what fully feeling once felt like. When emotional shutdown becomes familiar, the cycle stabilizes. You keep functioning, you keep producing, you keep holding it together, and that very pattern begins reinforcing itself. Psychology calls this negative reinforcement. When you use busyness, overworking, or emotional suppression to temporarily escape discomfort, anxiety decreases, at least for a moment. Your brain takes note, this works. So the next time distress rises, you respond the same way, only faster. You avoid rest because rest allows feelings to surface. You overthink instead of actually soothing yourself. You say yes because disappointing others feels unbearable. Each avoidance brings short-term relief and long-term extension of pain. There's another layer, identity. If you've always been the strong one, the reliable one, the one who doesn't fall apart, admitting that you're overwhelmed can feel like betraying who you are. So you keep performing the role. Over time, you may not even notice that you're no longer responding to life. You're maintaining a character. The suffering persists not because the original problem is unsolvable, but because the response pattern never changes. The cycle doesn't loosen when the stress disappears. It loosens the first time you don't automatically react the same way. That small interruption is where agency returns. By now, something may feel clearer. What exhausts you isn't only the pressure itself. It's how many times you've placed yourself last in response to it. You ignored the fatigue. You muted the emotion. You prioritized responsibility over internal truth. Eventually, you stopped knowing what you actually needed. This isn't a personality flaw, it's a survival strategy you learned well. When continuing to function felt safer than fully feeling, of course, you chose function. But cycles rarely break through dramatic life overhauls. Not through quitting everything, not through disappearing, not through rebuilding from zero. They begin to soften through something smaller. You start listening again. When you allow yourself to say, I'm tired. I'm scared. I need a pause. Your nervous system responds. When you honor a signal, even with 5 minutes of rest, you send a new message inward. I'm not abandoning you anymore. Healing isn't about defeating pain. It's about ending the fight against your own signals. You don't need to become stronger. You need to become someone who stays. The cycle existed because you once had no other option. But now you can choose connection over suppression, slower, softer, but more honest. And that shift, however small, is where change truly begins. This is Felix. May you understand yourself a little more deeply and treat the version of you that's still unfolding with patience and kindness. See you next time.